Imagine this. You're a 12-year-old boy living in a remote Bulgarian village in the year 1550. The morning fog drapes the valley like a heavy veil as you assist your father in tending to the sheep. The soft chime of the bells around their necks has been the gentle rhythm of your childhood. In the kitchen, your mother prepares breakfast, fresh bread and goat's milk, comforting and familiar, like the warmth and security of everything you've ever known. Then you hear it, the pounding of hooves striking the cobblestones. Your father's face drains of color. Your mother drops the clay jug in her hands, and it explodes against the floor like your entire world is about to break apart. Because everyone in your village understands the meaning of those hoofbeats, the Sultan's men have arrived. You hide behind a wooden cart, peering out as Ottoman officials climb down from their horses. Their silk garments remain immaculate despite the long trek. They carry scrolls and records, and their eyes sweep across the villages with the detached gaze of traders inspecting merchandise. When one of them points straight at you, your mother collapses to the ground, pleading in words they ignore. Your father stands motionless, knowing that any attempt to resist would cost the whole family their lives. They tear you away with assurances that you are destined for greatness, that serving the Sultan is a noble path. But as the cart pulls you away from everything you've ever known, your mother's cries fade into the mist. You will never hear her voice again. This marks the beginning of your new life, not as a son, but as a palace boy, a goom, in one of the most powerful empires on earth. And the nightmares awaiting you within the palace walls would make you yearn for those quiet days in the foggy hills, watching over sheep. Before we explore these long-buried stories of endurance and torment, if uncovering the hidden layers of history speaks to you, consider liking this video and subscribing for more content like this. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below. It's amazing to think we're rediscovering these forgotten pasts together from every corner of the world, bound by a shared fascination with the human journey through time. Your journey to Istanbul was your first encounter with the calculated brutality that would define your future. Alongside dozens of other boys, you were forced to march for weeks across unforgiving terrain. Food was scarce, shelter was rough or non-existent, and the cold nights showed no mercy. Those who slowed down, fell ill, or lost the will to go on were left to perish. You learned your first and most brutal lesson in Ottoman palace life long before reaching the city. In this world, weakness meant death, and only those who were strong, smart, or endlessly adaptable stood a chance of surviving the ordeal that lay ahead. The boy walking beside you, perhaps 14 years old, had been taken from a small Greek fishing village. His name was Nikos, though he confided in you that it wouldn't be his name for much longer. On the third night of the journey, he attempted to escape. He didn't get far, barely a mile before the guards caught him. They dragged him back to the camp and beat him in front of everyone as a brutal example. His cries echoed across the hills, and you clenched your eyes shut, hoping to silence the sound. But the lesson remained clear. Escape was futile. Resistance meant suffering. By the time you approached the outskirts of Istanbul, you had learned how to vanish in plain sight, to speak only when directly addressed, to remain unseen when the guards' gazes turned cruel. You had witnessed boys vanish during the night, some who had tried to flee, others who simply could no longer bear the burden of another day. The gaps they left behind in the line were constant, grim reminders of your own fragility. Your first glimpse of Istanbul should have filled you with awe, the minarets slicing into the heavens, the majestic dome of the Hagia Sophia, the vast palace complex that would soon imprison you. But instead, a heavy emptiness took root in your chest. That splendid city skyline represented everything that had been taken from you and everything you feared you were about to become. Once in Istanbul, your initiation began. Ottoman officials sorted the surviving boys into categories based on perceived talent and promise. The evaluation process was intrusive and humiliating. They inspected your teeth as if judging livestock, checked your reflexes, quizzed your basic knowledge of letters and numbers. They measured your stature, scrutinized your skin, and analyzed your face with the detached precision of curators studying sculptures. The The most attractive and intelligent were selected for the Palace Academy Enderun. Others were designated for the Janissary Corps, the Empire's elite military force. But those chosen to serve inside the palace faced an ordeal that would test more than physical strength. It would challenge your very essence and strip you of your identity. You were among the select few admitted into the Enderun school, located deep within the walls of Topkapi Palace. The officials who picked you noted your smooth complexion, sharp gaze, and keen mind, and they smiled. At the time, you mistook those smiles for kindness. You would later realize they were the smiles of men who saw in you a valuable possession. The Enderun School has often been described as the world's first structured academy for the gifted. While this label may be accurate in a technical sense, it hides a harsher truth. For boys like you, displaced and isolated, education meant something far more sinister. Yes, you would be taught Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. You would study law, literature, the sciences, astronomy, and mathematics. You would receive training in music, craftsmanship, and calligraphy. But the cost of this education went well beyond intellectual labor. It was a toll paid with your spirit, your body, and your past. The palace compound that now defined your existence was a labyrinth of polished marble corridors, lavish chambers, and shadowy corners where danger always seemed to lurk. You were housed in dormitories deep within the palace grounds, sealed off from the outside world by layers of walls, guarded checkpoints, and rituals so rigid that the idea of escape wasn't just unlikely, it was unthinkable. The dormitory where you were expected to sleep stretched out like a tomb of stone, its rows of narrow beds dressed in silk that felt less like luxury and more like a binding shroud. That first night, you lay awake and listened to the sobs of frightened boys muffled into pillows, to the low murmurs of foreign tongues, to the soft but deliberate footsteps of older students and watchful supervisors stalking the halls after dark. In your palm, you clutched a small wooden cross, your mother's last gift as you were taken from her arms. But by morning, even that sacred connection to your past had been uncovered and stripped away. They gave you a new name. Mesmetand instructed you to forget your Christian roots. Conversion to the Empire's official religion wasn't a matter of belief or choice, it was mandatory, the cornerstone of your transformation from a stolen child into an obedient servant of the state. The ritual was held with grandeur as though you had freely chosen your fate, but you knew and everyone knew that no such choice existed. You repeated their words because you had to, but your heart clung to the sound of your mother's lullabies and your father's fireside tales. Yet the darkest part of your education wasn't the language drills or calligraphy lessons, it was the calculated dismantling of your identity and your reassembly as a tool for Imperial use. The palace was built on layers of hierarchy where climbing higher depended not only on your intellect but also on your ability to appease your superiors, and appeasing came in forms no child should ever be forced to comprehend. Your first glimpse of this twisted reality came from Amit, an older boy who had already endured 3 years in the system. One evening, he slipped into your dormitory uninvited, settling on the edge of your bed with a voice that held both warning and allure. "You're new," he said. "You don't know how things work yet, but I can guide you, keep you safe, help you get ahead. The teachers respect me, and they trust my word when it comes to the younger boys." He placed a hand on your shoulder, and your body tensed. At 12, you had never been touched by a stranger, but something about his tone chilled you to the core. "In return," he added in a whisper, "you'll have to show appreciation. There are ways boys like you can express gratitude, private ways, just between us. You were trapped in a cruel dilemma one that countless boys before you had faced. If you refused, you risked brutal retribution, isolation, and the complete erasure of any path to survival. If you accepted, you began sacrificing the last fragments of your innocence to a machine that treated your body as currency. To accept meant surrendering the last remnants of your childhood innocence, handing your body over to a system that saw it as currency, a tool to barter for safety and advancement. There was no right answer, only the path of survival. The palace's sexual hierarchy was deeply entrenched and predatory. governed by customs shaped through centuries of institutional abuse. Eunuch Sansei boys themselves who had suffered the same fate held significant authority, and often used it to take advantage of the endless influx of fresh captives. They understood the palace's workings in intimate detail, not just because they operated it, but because they had once been its victims. Yet instead of breaking the cycle, many became its most zealous enforcers. Older students preyed on newcomers, maintaining a long-standing chain of victimization. It was an ugly tradition of abuse, disguised as initiation. Those who had endured suffering earned their place by inflicting it on others. Officials within the palace hierarchy exploited their power to pursue the most attractive boys without fear of consequences. They knew these children had no advocates, no way to seek justice. What made this structure especially disturbing was how deeply it was woven into the palace's formal hierarchy. These exploitative relationships weren't hidden, they were accepted as normal, part of palace life, embedded so thoroughly they appeared ordinary. A boy who caught the interest of an influential mentor might be rewarded with rapid promotion, gentler treatment, or extra privileges. But those who resisted or failed to please were cast aside, pushed into degrading duties, punished more harshly, or erased from palace records altogether. The psychological toll on boys like you was immense and meticulously engineered. Separated from your family, stripped of your past, and trapped in a world where your worth was tied to your appearance, you developed what today might be identified as complex trauma. Some boys adapted by becoming shrewd and manipulative, using their bodies as leverage to survive. Others shut down emotionally, performing their duties like ghosts, hollowed out by the weight of constant dread. You witnessed both types of transformations. Dimitri, who came from the same region as you, learned how to charm older students and instructors. Within half a year, he had new garments, better meals, and a private tutor, but the light had left his eyes, and he never spoke of home again. When fresh boys arrived, he regarded them with the same cold calculation that had once been turned on him. Stefanos, a Greek boy from a humble fishing family, chose defiance. He rejected every advance, endured beatings and relentless discipline, and over time faded into something spectral. He went through each day like a shadow, compliant but silent, his spirit slowly slipping away. He completed his tasks without emotion, studied well enough to avoid punishment but never with interest, and each day seemed to slip further away. One morning, his bed was vacant and no one. You tried to strike a delicate balance, complying just enough to endure while holding on to some inner part of yourself that remained untouched. But the palace was engineered to crush such attempts. Every day presented new dilemmas, fresh decisions between disgrace and destruction, more tactics designed to mold you into a reflection of the system's desires. Occasionally, European visitors to the Ottoman court caught glimpses of this hidden world, though their interpretations were colored by their own cultural perspectives and limited insight. A Venetian ambassador in the 16th century commented on the unsettling affection palace officials displayed toward their youthful male attendants. He described scenes that disturbed him deeply: young boys, some as young as 10 or 11, dressed in ornate silks and jewelry, interacting with older men in ways that hinted at relationships well beyond acceptable norms between servant and master. A French envoy, writing in the 17th century, offered a more candid description of what he saw at a formal reception. The young attendants glide through the corridors like elegant birds trapped in cages, their eyes lowered, their bodies adorned like ornaments. It is impossible not to notice the possessive stares of certain officials, or the fear that flashes in the children's eyes when their superiors approach. The psychological torment was magnified by the palace's physical conditions, all carefully crafted to erode your defenses and foster dependence. You lived packed into tight quarters with barely any privacy. Every moment of your day was watched, regulated, and controlled. You were roused before sunrise for prayers you had no choice but to learn. Meals were scheduled and sufficient, but never generous. The strict daily routine left no room for solitude, rebellion, or even thought. Punishments were frequent and deliberately degrading, meant to humiliate and crush the will. Boys who broke the rules, whether by speaking their native tongues, clinging to their cultural practices, or showing too little enthusiasm for palace life, were whipped, shamed in public, or locked in tiny cells too cramped to stretch out in. You once saw a boy named Milos punished for praying in his old religious tradition. He was forced to stand unclothed in the courtyard all day while others were encouraged to laugh and jeer. The message was unmistakable. Your past identity wasn't just banned, it was something to be ashamed of. The palace also had its own economy, a hierarchy of privilege that made your situation even more entangled and exploitative. Small luxuries could be earned through obedience, academic excellence, or currying favor with those in power. These rewards, extra food, softer clothes, better sleeping quarters, or access to books and music, became priceless in your confined reality. The system crafted a tangle of favors and dependencies so intricate that fighting back seemed impossible, and cooperating, no matter the cost, often felt like the only option for survival. You learned to maneuver through this internal economy with the shrewdness of someone far older than your years. You discovered that assisting older students with their assignments could sometimes earn you a degree of protection. From their advances, you realized that excelling in certain disciplines might attract the attention of instructors who could, at times, act as buffers against the worst forms of abuse. You learned that unwavering compliance and a show of enthusiasm for your new identity could result in privileges that, though minor, felt immense within the constraints of your narrow world. Some boys dared to escape, but the palace's geographic isolation perched on a peninsula encircled by water made such attempts nearly impossible. Those who were captured faced brutal consequences, made public as cautionary theater. You saw it yourself, a boy dragged back, half drowned after trying to swim across the Golden Horn. The savage beating he endured in front of everyone left him permanently maimed. He became a walking warning, crippled, castrated, a reminder of the punishment that awaited rebellion. Even those who did manage to flee faced an agonizing reality. Their time in the palace had erased so much of who they once were that returning home was futile. Their families might not recognize them. Their villages could see them as traitors or apostates. And outside the palace, they lacked the basic skills for survival. Most were recaptured within days. The few who remained free often found themselves adrift, strangers to the world, cut off from both past and future. As you grew within this system, surviving by intelligence, flexibility, and precise submission, you encountered new threats, darker, deeper compromises. Some of the brightest boys eventually rose to prestigious roles in the Imperial structure, but such triumphs demanded total participation in the very machine that had once devoured them. You came to understand, with rising dread, that your mentors and wardens, the ones who had molded and scarred you, had once been boys like you, taken, broken, reshaped into loyal instruments of empire. This revelation led to a devastating choice: to defy the system and likely be destroyed, or to fully embrace it and become part of its engine. That meant choosing the next crop of boys, dismantling their spirits, rebuilding them into perfect servants, and upholding the layers of abuse and dominance that formed the palace's hidden backbone. Many chose the latter, finding it easier to become the predator than to remain the prey. The graduation ceremony, called Chikma, signaled the end of your time within the palace school and your official entry into the empire's bureaucracy. After enduring years of trauma, masked as education, you emerged as a refined young man, fluent in several languages, trained in law, administration, and diplomacy, and versed in both the sciences and the arts. But you also emerged as someone whose moral core had been reshaped, whose understanding of authority was rooted in exploitation, and whose ability to form genuine human bonds had been fractured in ways that might never fully mend. For many who completed their palace education, this transition simply meant stepping from one form of exploitation into another. Those placed in bureaucratic roles entered a world where political advancement remained inseparably linked to sexual manipulation, and where the principles of dominance, obedience, and survival instilled during their youth continued to govern their adult relationships. Those directed into military service carried the psychological weight of their palace upbringing, often becoming either ruthless instruments of imperial enforcement or emotionally fractured men, struggling to give purpose to lives rooted in suffering. The Ottoman ruling class's view of these practices was deliberately nuanced, structured to preserve the system while publicly disavowing its darkest truths. Though official policies technically outlawed many abuses, in practice, palace leaders routinely ignored misconduct that furthered their goals. The machine was designed to churn out efficient administrators and loyal subjects. The human toll it exacted was seen as an acceptable cost. Any external criticism was dismissed as misunderstanding the complexity and sophistication of the empire's elite education model. Even some Ottoman scholars admitted the system's grim dimensions, though always framed within justifications. A historian at the imperial court in the 16th century once wrote, "Indeed, the palace school demands immense sacrifices, and not all who enter leave unchanged. But from this forge of discipline and knowledge emerge the empire's finest men, tested in loyalty and perfected in skill." Such rhetoric of refinement and elevation concealed the truth lived by boys like you. What they called testing was in fact prolonged sexual exploitation. What they labeled discipline was the violent destruction of your original identity, replaced with a carefully constructed persona built solely to serve imperial ambitions. The education you received came at the cost of your innocence and your capacity for meaningful human connection. What made the palace system especially sinister was how effectively it merged real educational achievement with systematic violation. Yes, by historical standards, the instruction was elite. You mastered literacy in multiple languages, granting you access to cultural and diplomatic arenas across the known world. You were educated in sciences, mathematics, and strategic thought at levels uncommon in your era. You were groomed for high-stakes governance, diplomacy, and warfare. But this learning was bound inseparably to your degradation. The same mentors who sharpened your intellect also used your body. The same structure that paved your road to success also stole your childhood. The same school that lifted you into prominence ensured that your every step forward would be haunted by what was sacrificed to get there. This system also reveals a broader and unsettling truth about the intersection of power, sexuality, and violence in early societies. The Ottomans were far from alone in their exploitation of children. Variations of these abuses existed in ancient Greece, medieval Europe, and across empires old and new. But the Ottoman system stood out for its sheer scale, its meticulous organization, and its full incorporation into the machinery of imperial rule. This was not a hidden vice, but an institutional reality celebrated for its effectiveness and fiercely defended by those who benefited from it. By the 1600s and 1700s, this palace model began to wane. Advances in military technology lessened the need for janissary forces, and evolving administrative practices reduced reliance on graduates of the palace schools. European cultural influence and shifting values also played a role in the system's gradual decline. Yet for the countless boys who entered the palace at the height of this regime, those changes arrived far too late. Their childhoods were sacrificed, their innocence stripped away, and their spirits crushed in service of imperial ambition, marking one of history's most organized and enduring forms of state-sanctioned child exploitation. Those who endured learned to navigate a world where their physical beauty was both weapon and weakness, where their intellect was prized but their personhood was discarded, where advancement demanded the surrender of something essential and irreplaceable. Some climbed high, becoming viziers, commanders, or governors who helped steer the empire's future. But they carried with them the deep scars of their upbringing and often repeated the same cycles of abuse that had once consumed them. Others vanished into anonymity, their fates unmarked and their pain undocumented, reduced to nameless entries in imperial archives that recorded only their selection, instruction, and final placement. The walls of the palace, once echoing with the soft footsteps of frightened boys, still rise to dare imagined as a grand museum. Tourists admire the majestic architecture and ornate artistry of the Ottoman court. They gaze at the refined chambers where elites were once educated, unaware of the suffering hidden behind those polished surfaces. The marble passageways keep their silence, and the rooms where education and exploitation were inextricably linked offer no clues about the price paid by generations of captive children. The official tours speak proudly of the school's contributions, its innovative instruction, its production of capable statesmen, its role in sustaining the empire's glory. They say nothing of the routine abuse that underpinned this success, nothing of the children who perished rather than submit, nothing of the men who emerged from this system permanently altered by what they endured within those polished halls. As I close this account, picturing your story as emblematic of thousands more, I'm reminded that these narratives are not just relics of the past. They reflect real lives, real children, stolen from their homes, stripped of their names, and thrust into a system that honored their intellects and appearances, but discarded their humanity. They were used in the service of empire, discarded when no longer needed. You, the imagined boy standing frozen in those marble corridors, fear in your chest and silence on your lips, represent thousands of real children. Children whose names have been lost to time, whose personal histories were never written down, and whose pain was never acknowledged by the very structure that both created and perpetuated it. Your spirit and the spirits of every boy like you still linger in those palace walls, reminding us that the majesty of empire is often built upon layers of suffering. The cost of power, as history shows us again and again, is most often paid by those without the power to choose their fate. The true horror lay not just in the acts of violence themselves, but in the calculated way they were imposed, how deeply they became routine, and how thoroughly they have been erased from collective memory. You and those like you lived and died in a regime that treated your body as ornament, your being as raw material to be shaped and consumed. And your story is not a curious relic of history, it is a testament to endurance in the face of orchestrated cruelty. The misty dawns that once carried the sound of your hesitant footsteps are gone, but your legacy has not vanished. Your experience still reverberates, urging us to acknowledge what was endured and to recognize the unimaginable cost behind the empire's splendor. By recalling your journey, we do more than remember one child's suffering. We shed light on the suffering of every child caught in the mechanisms of domination. Children exploited and discarded by systems that place conquest above compassion, power above innocence.